Today, we will look at the human evolution family tree. In the previous lecture and in the Darwin's Finches article, you discovered that evolution can be brought about by environmental changes, natural selection, and cultural evolution. With regard to environmental changes, this can be due to changes in climate or within the ecological landscape an organism finds itself. In the case of the Finches article, we saw how changes in the environment caused corresponding changes in the food supply available for the finches to consume. The seeds that were available to the finches, especially after periods of drought, affected which finches survived due to their beak size and shape. Therefore, the climate change that took place in the Galapagos Islands created an environment that favored certain finches having beak size and shapes that were able to consume the seeds that were available. These finches survived and were able to produce offspring, allowing for future generations of finches to carry on with those traits that allowed the finches to adapt to the changes that took place in the environment. In other words, the article provides an example of how changes in the environment and natural selection work to affect evolutionary processes. As the article points out, the finches studied taught that natural selection is an observable, interpretable, and repeatable process in a natural environment. It oscillates in direction and happens when the environment changes and has evolutionary consequences. In other words, adaptive change. With regard to natural selection, we learned in the last module that nature selects from the genetic diversity of a population those traits that would make an individual more likely to survive and reproduce in a continuously changing environment, and that over many years and many generations, the full diversity of life on Earth is expressed through this process of adaptation. Charles Darwin, in developing his theory that evolution took place by means of natural selection, developed four postulates that have been modified over the years as we became knowledgeable about the role our DNA and genetics has in the evolutionary process and in the inheritance of genes from one generation to the next. Again, these four postulates can be summarized as the result of mutations creating new alleles, the process of segregation and independent assortment that takes place in the production of gametes allows for the shuffling of the alleles, the genetic code for specific traits, into new combinations, allowing for variability within the individuals of a given species population. These alleles, genetic traits, if you will, are passed on to future generations. In every generation, some individuals are better adapted and therefore survive, increasing their ability to reproduce and pass their genes on to future generations. The individuals within a species population that survive and reproduce do so because they have the genetic traits, the alleles, and the allelic combinations that increases their adaptability to the environment. Because of this, we learned that genetic mutations and genetic drift can serve as mechanisms to evolutionary change over long periods of time. Finally, the Finches article draws our attention briefly to the idea that culture can also affect our ability to adapt and serve as a factor in the evolutionary process. Specifically, the article looked at how the mating song of the finches affects sexual selection and potentially keep species or variants within a species or subspecies apart. Therefore, sexual selection plays a role in the evolutionary process. Certainly, one can imagine how culture may play an even more significant role in the evolutionary development of primates, especially the evolutionary history of humans. Culture includes technology and our material culture, the artifacts we make or influence through our interaction. For example, technology, the tools that were used by our early ancestors, have helped us to adapt to changes in the environment and different ecological niches. Because of this, we were able to evolve over time to adjust to diverse conditions based on the based on the culture played in the evolutionary process of our species. Another concept that is important to know is adaptive radiation. Adaptive radiation is a process in which organisms diversify rapidly from an ancestral species into a multitude of new forms, particularly when a change in the environment makes new resources available, creates new challenges, or opens new environmental niches. Therefore, after a change takes place in the environment, for example, an organism will evolve into new forms, and these new forms will rapidly demonstrate a diversification of traits that will compete through the natural selection process.